Hey everybody, I'm so glad you're here. Today is our 19th episode for our Bay Area Housing Market Town Hall. And I'm very excited because I have invited Justin Goodman. He is an attorney in the Bay Area, and he emphasizes in the landlord-tenant and also contract disputes. He spent over a decade tackling difficult problems created by rent control ordinances in San Francisco, Oakland, and Berkeley. And he specializes in the Ellis Act and also other non-fault terminations. But what he is focusing on is to look for the holistic solutions to avoid prolonged legal fights, because who wants to be in the prolonged legal fights? It's never pleasant, no matter which side you're on. So I am very excited and honored today to have Justin Goodman to be here and speak to us. So Justin, I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you so much.
As Helen said, I'm an attorney in San Francisco, Zacks, Freedman, Patterson. I'm also a board member of the Small Property Owners. The Small Property Owners is an affiliate of Cal RHA, the California Rental Housing Association. They have regional groups all over the place. That is a great group to join if you want to make a difference and you want to stay informed. What I thought would be helpful to talk about today, though, I'm regularly telling, I'm a practicing attorney and I like being involved in the community as much as possible, but that's my skill set. And what I find myself regularly telling clients is, I'll give you the legal advice, but you have to make your own business decisions. And when I talk about business decisions, I'm referring to the skill set that you all have, that you're all learning more about today. So my goal today is just to give you a general understanding of the framework that is going to affect real estate investment in the Bay Area. And you can't really talk about that without talking about rent control. So modern rent control started in the late 70s, early 80s. It was somewhat of a knee-jerk reaction. So I think an important thing to recall, though, is that these emergency ordinances, they froze the rent, and then they were finally amended to grow with inflation over time. Inflation adjustment for rents, it's not a windfall by any means. It just survives a constitutional challenge. But 40 years ago, the price-controlled rents of today were yesterday's market rents. So there really was not a lot of market distortion. But you flash forward 40 years and there's market distortion all over the place, and there are seesawing regulations to try to cope with the consequences of this. We got in 2019 the first statewide comprehensive eviction and rent control ordinance. You probably know this as AB 1482, and it for the first time set rents on everything in California with some narrow exceptions, and set just cause for eviction rules for California with some exceptions. Now, an important exception there is that they figure if a city already had a rent control or eviction control ordinance and it was at least as strict or constrained prices at least as much as California was trying to do, cities, you figured it out. We don't need to tell you how to do your job. So the Bay Area rent control jurisdictions, for the most part, are still valid on their face. They still speak to what the law is in those jurisdictions. Everywhere else, or where they don't apply, you're limited to the lesser of a 5% annual increase or 10% overall. This wants to apply to all residential rental property. And unlike local jurisdictions that, again, have to survive this constitutional rigor, there doesn't seem to be any banking. Banking is when you skip an increase one year and then you impose 2 increases the next year. So it does seem to motivate landlords to increase the rents even if they don't want to, but that is the law as it currently exists. There is an exemption for new construction, which state law defines as anything built within the last 15 years, and that target is a floating one. I believe every California rent control jurisdiction has an exemption for new construction, and because of a state law I'll describe in a second, they all have to. The idea there is it wants to motivate the creation of new, safe, affordable, and decent housing, and there are worries that if everything is price constricted and price controlled, developers won't be interested in that. So for 15 years, you get your return on investment. That date, again, is a rolling one, so eventually it'll become subject to the ordinance. Single family homes, for the most part, will be exempt from rent and eviction controls, provided that they're not owned by an entity. If they're owned by natural persons, that's fine. I think that's to give a break to the mom and pop landlords out there. And importantly, state law has vacancy decontrol. This means that if a tenancy ends because the tenant voluntarily vacates, or if they were evicted for fault, the landlord is no longer constrained in what they can charge for rent. This means that if something was longer term tenancy and is under market and the tenant leaves, the market sets the price. Now, before AB 1482, landlords were mostly subject to the whims of these local rent control ordinances. There was vacancy control, the opposite of vacancy decontrol. And that meant that you registered your rents with the local rent board, and whether or not the unit was vacated, that was the most you could charge for it. And these ordinances, these strict rent control ordinances, existed in Berkeley, Santa Monica, West Hollywood, East Palo Alto, and until the mid 90s, where California rushed to sort of resolve this conflict of spreading vacancy control, this idea that everything was going to be constrained. They were worried about investment in improving the quality of housing and in making more housing. So the balance that was struck is called the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act. I think it's become a household name at this point, because in the last 4 years, there have been 3 attempts to repeal it. Most recently, last year's Proposition 21, which got a little bit more personal. It wanted to repeal it and replace it with something pretty draconian for property owners. So fortunately, all of them have lost, but there is always the next challenge to Costa-Hawkins on the horizon. And it's important when that happens to get involved, to donate to the cause, and to protect investment, because property owners in California, they want to be providing decent housing to their tenants, but they want to know that they're not going to be punished for entering that market. And they want to know that they're going to get a fair return on investment. Costa-Hawkins also decontrols new construction. If there's an existing regulation and an existing date of new construction and a local ordinance, it freezes that into place. It wants to exempt most single family homes and most condominiums, as long as the property owner is not the original subdivider. There's some interesting interplay between AB 1482, the state law one, and local jurisdictions that have these other exemptions. This is all kind of new, and the courts have not had occasion to resolve them yet, so stay tuned on that. But if you have something that seemingly would be exempted by one body of law and not by another, then best thing to do is to ask a lawyer and get some more information about that. But again, Costa-Hawkins, importantly, imposes vacancy decontrol.
I wanted to make a comment just now with all these rent control, and he mentioned quite a few different cities like Santa Monica, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Berkeley. Oh, you're back. I was just about to make some comments regarding the rent control, because like all those cities that you have mentioned that have these like really strict rent control, Oakland, San Francisco, Berkeley, Santa Monica. I mean, honestly, we really haven't seen the rents like come down before, even though this rent control has been in place for many, many years now. So it's always in the back of my mind, and probably a lot of you are asking this question. So does rent control really work?
Oh, well, it works to create a special benefit for an incumbent class of tenants, and those are particularly the ones that have been there the longest. I myself, for instance, am a tenant in San Francisco. I have been the 12 years I've been here, and I have not found myself to personally benefit from rent control in my private life. I benefit from it greatly in my professional life. But the reason is because every time I move, I'm a market rate tenant, and the body of regulations is not really designed to benefit me. I had mentioned this idea of rent-controlled rents in the early 80s being yesterday's market rents, but now you flash forward and you can have 2 identical units in a duplex, one paying $1,000 and one paying $4,000 a month. And, arguably that's not fair to the market rate tenant, and this other one is getting a special privilege. The policy in terms of land use and promoting development seems to be that we don't have to do it. We can just focus on making sure that rent controlled tenants never move. When they move, again, that's vacancy decontrol, and that will increase the price. But if we can prevent that from happening with things like eviction controls or punishing the evicting of tenants with taking away land use rights, well, that's a way to keep rental rates lower in the aggregate. And unfortunately, I think that's creating even more scarcity, because cities like mine, San Francisco, focus on that issue, on keeping tenants in their rental units, instead of focusing on the production of more housing and trying to drive prices down with an increase in supply. think talking about the effect of supply and demand on housing prices is like a swear word in San Francisco and some other cities, but it is a factor, and it's something that ideally someone would be considering in a holistic approach to housing. And unfortunately, that is one of the consequences. The benefit, of course, is, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, like, the supply and demand is like Econ 101, right? I mean, that is truly, in my mind and in a lot of people's mind, it's like that's truly the way to control the pricing. You have to increase supply, but we are not really increasing supply. And just like what you're saying, by implementing these rent controls are really not helping by providing more affordable housing out there.
Yeah, and to answer the actual question you asked me, is it good for tenants? I think that's a yes and a no. It depends on the tenant. One of the problems is it prevents mobility, because if your housing cost is very low as long as you stay put, but your family size changes or your needs or your job changes, you can't really move. There's also a problem where if you stay in your rental unit for 20, 30 years and the landlord is not really able to make those updates without disrupting your life significantly, those updates don't get made. And so the quality of the housing, through no fault of the property owner, tends to dwindle over time. So there's a lot of internal tensions in these regulations. And I think the important thing to focus on from an investment perspective is, if you're looking to buy a property, what is it that you're actually buying? What are the rental rates? Are they unlawfully high? Could they be reset by the tenant if they go to the rent board and then all of a sudden you thought your rent rolls were here and they drop down a little bit? Are you buying a property with long-term tenants and deferred maintenance and claims that the tenants have based on this argument that, for instance, you did not give me quality housing because you hoped I'd wander away and you get a vacancy decontrol and a financial upside, and therefore you had this unlawful pecuniary motivation to sort of constructively evict me. So it's important to know the tenants and their backstory, I think, when you're considering an investment in these properties, to know what those claims might be, and to know that the rents that are coming in are going to be rents you can rely on. Another interesting challenge for the home game is because of vacancy control, there is potential upside that really is the result of chance. If a tenant, again, if their family size changes, or you talked in the market report about people moving, for instance, from California to Texas, if people are doing that because their jobs change and they had a submarket tenancy, that's an immediate financial upside for the landlord. And it's hard to predict these things. So I guess the more you know about the anecdotal history of your tenant, maybe you could try to predict this, but that's an interesting upside in rent controlled jurisdictions that has not previously existed in California and Bay Area real estate at large. We're also seeing a batch of rent registration laws. So San Francisco, we got one, I think towards the end of last year, earlier this year. AB 1188 is a California bill right now that came out of the assembly. Basically what this requires is that you notify, in this case, I think it'll all be governed at the city or county level. You notify when the tenancy started and what the rental rate is, and you inform a city entity of those changes over time. And if you don't do it, you lose the right to do things like impose those rent increases. I don't know that I have a particular problem with this. And in fact, I think it will take out some of the swings in liability if everybody is dealing with a known quantity. But I do see some pressures here in terms of driving out mom and pop landlords who are going to have a harder time keeping up with these regulations. So overall, I'm not really concerned about these things. But again, we've only seen these penalties in the form of register and then you get your rent increase. And I suppose if the penalties get worse, that would be something to be aware of. Another budding regulation I wanted to discuss is COPA regulation, or TOPA. So that could be the Community or Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. We got one in San Francisco, I want to say 2 years ago, although it seems like 2020 didn't exist or all happened in a single moment. I think that's about right, 2 years ago. Basically what this says is when an investor is looking to buy multi-unit property occupied by tenants, the concern of a city that wants to maintain affordable housing, again, because it has a sub-market rent because of rent control, and they're worried about tenant displacement, they want to get certain nonprofit groups together, usually with financial backing from the city in the form of lower than normal rate mortgages or second mortgages that the city government will fund themselves. They give them the right of first refusal. So they'll get an early indication that the property is going to be listed or is listed. They'll have time to do some basic due diligence. They'll make an offer. The seller doesn't have to accept it. Then the seller lists the property. The market decides what the price should be. And if they want, they can bid at that price too. They get the right of first offer and the right of first refusal. I have some concerns about the compulsive need to regulate every nook and cranny that has not been regulated. But from an investment perspective, I don't see this as particularly onerous. It'll delay the process of selling a unit, but ultimately it's the market that's deciding the price. So you might not get that multi-unit property you want to invest in, but on a long enough timeline, there will be another one out there. But I think a big reason that cities, local governments are concerned about this and why they want to, quote unquote, rescue a property like this with low paying tenants from a new purchaser is because of financial upside found in the change of use from rental property to non-rental property. And now, of course, we're talking about the Ellis Act, the withdrawal of residential property from the rental market. The Ellis Act was adopted in, I think, 1986 in response to a 1985 opinion that said if you have housing that is safe and not about to fall over, you have to get city permission before you can demolish it, before you can change it away from rental use. The basic procedures are you're giving either a 4-month notice or a 1-year notice, depending on if the tenant is elderly or disabled. That will change on individual units, but eventually you withdraw the entire property from the rental market. And these constraints last for 5 years in terms of vacancy control. So this is one of the rare circumstances where something will still be rent restricted. The displaced tenants will all get the right to come back for 10 years. But really, this is the constraints if you do rent it. The idea is you are not renting it. You don't want to be thinking about renting it. Don't try to get too clever with this. People get sued for trying to be too clever with this. And 2 or 3 years ago, we got an amendment to the Ellis Act in response to a landlord in West Hollywood who was too clever about this, but she actually did it right. And so they were upset about this over in Sacramento. They amended the Ellis Act. The reason that there is large financial upside here is because if you're evaluating multi-unit property based on its rent rolls and the rent rolls are low and price constrained by regulation and cannot be changed, well, now all of a sudden it's hard to carry the cost of that building, especially as a new buyer, or you get new property tax assessments. You are dealing with things that need updating, and it's great that the rents have increased with the rate of inflation, but your plumber is still charging 2021 rates for plumbing work. It's hard to maintain properties sometimes. Versus if the properties are vacant, you price it based on square foot potentially for TIC ownership. This is similar to condominium conversion. Some jurisdictions will actually allow condominium conversion after the Ellis Act. A lot of them don't. But to sell a TIC interest, basically multiple owners are all owning fractional shares in the grant deed, and then they have a separate contract called the TIC agreement that assigns to them a single unit with an exclusive right of occupancy, and then this becomes their home. And then generally with these properties, the value based on price per square foot for owner occupancy is much more than the rent controlled rate. But this is one of the reasons regulations and nonprofits under things like COPA and TOPA will want to scout out a building with these tenants and essentially rescue them if they think that the Ellis Act is an option on the horizon.
Dominic has a question. Is it okay for him to ask a question? And Christine as well.
Yeah, so first question is this just for multi-family unit properties? And second part of that question, is the city sourcing, like, do landlords have to let the city know that they're going to be looking to sell so that the tenants can know that they can possibly purchase the property?
Oh, I think you're talking about the Community Opportunity to Purchase Act.
Yeah, the COPA.
So far, so we have it in San Francisco. They've been toying with the idea of encouraging it at the state level. So the rules will be specific to the jurisdiction, but for the most part, it's looking at multi-unit properties. So it would not cover single-family homes. And sorry, repeat your second question.
And is it going to be just the city and those non-for-profit organizations that either a landlord has to let them know, hey, we're looking to sell, so that they can have that first right of refusal, or how is that? How are they organized?
Oh yeah. There's requirements to notify a panel of nonprofits, at least the way San Francisco operates. You have to do that, and if you don't, there's severe liability to the seller who tries to do a pocket deal. Ironically, the way that this can be competitive for nonprofits, in part, is that they actually have needs-based price controls. If you're in a unit that's too big, they want to move you to a smaller unit. They want to make sure that they will also increase the rents based on financial ability to some extent, instead of the rent controlled rate. So ironically, some tenants don't want their building to be purchased by one of these programs, but it will depend on the jurisdiction. And it's important to understand the local one if you're selling or buying property in it. So to add to, we were discussing AB 854. So this is a bill, it's actually going to be discussed in the Committee on Housing and Community Development tomorrow. It starts at 2 o'clock, and I think I will put in the chat for everybody who would like to listen in and participate to the extent that you can. Any thoughts that you'd like to share with the Assembly. But the basic idea here is, unless you've owned a property for 5 years, they do not want you withdrawing it under the Ellis Act. And if you have ever withdrawn a property under the Ellis Act and you buy another property within 10 years, they want to disqualify it outright. The focus of this, and maybe a solution without a problem, is that they want to curtail the use of the Ellis Act by developers. They don't want developers buying properties with long-term tenants, displacing them and selling it to people as TICs. But I think there are a lot of problems with that. One of them is, again, if you have these very long-term tenancies and these buildings that are not being repaired, that's a problem for the tenants. It's a problem for the community. It is always sad when somebody has to lose their home, and many of these people, unfortunately, have built a lifestyle around subsidized low market rents, and they're not going to find that in the same community. This is not obviously ideal for those tenants, but it is a way to actually fulfill the promise of rent control, which is to provide safe, decent housing. It doesn't update itself. It actually decays over time. So it's a process to renew existing housing stock. It's an opportunity to provide first-time home buyers their first home in the form of a TIC. Obviously, we are not enthusiastic about this over at the small property owners. CalRA, the state affiliate, is opposing it. These are links so you can listen in and you can let the committee know how you feel about it if you would like to oppose it. And you can also, I encourage, join CalRA, join CAA, that's the California Apartment Association. These are all great resources to be notified about upcoming laws like this and to be able to push back when the opportunity comes up.
I just copy and paste what you typed in here on our Facebook page as well.
Very good. All right. And
David asked a question, sorry. Community Purchase Act, what if sellers just list a price so high the nonprofit cannot compete?
I think, well, initially it's just a first offer that the nonprofit makes. So it's take it or leave it. You're under no obligation to deal with them. If you have if you don't take it, then it goes to the market and you get a market clearing price in the form of an arm's length transaction, a bona fide offer, and they can purchase it for that same offer. So there's not really a mechanism to try to ward them off in that way. Mm-hmm. And I would think a seller of property wouldn't want to anyway, because if this is offered on the open market, they're going to get the market price for it.
Exactly.
It make a difference who it comes from.
Exactly.
And then just a few thoughts, and I'm curious to hear your other questions, but just in terms of investment strategy in general, it's always a good idea. I get a lot of consultations that are just, single hour with a single prospective client on a property they're thinking about purchasing, and they ask me a lot of questions. And again, I don't craft people's business models. I don't give them business advice, but I will tell them the regulations that affect their property, what they need to know to make an informed decision. And sometimes that will be, based on your need, I would discourage you from buying this. There are other opportunities out there. There are some investors that want more of a turnkey operation, and there are plenty of jurisdictions where there are not such onerous regulations. There are also other kinds of investments like buying a strip mall instead of multi-unit apartment. But I think that would be the easiest. And then the more high risk, high reward, I suppose, would be rent controlled jurisdictions, Berkeley, Oakland, San Francisco in particular, where sometimes the upside comes in the form of a keep and hold strategy where eventually tenancies will move out. Sometimes landlords will acquire a property like that and they will try to offer buyout agreements. These are now largely regulated in those same cities and in other cities throughout California, usually only in the form of giving a tenant a cool off period where they can rescind an agreement after they've entered it. But in simplest terms, it's just offering money in exchange for the tenant moving. That could be for a variety of reasons, like the owner wants to live in the property themselves, but it could also just be, if I paid you $50,000 and it increases the value of my property to $250,000 because I can charge market rent, I have made money doing this. So basically just another way to invest in your investment. And yeah, overall, in terms of properties you want to purchase or advising your clients, I can't stress enough, just think about the property you want to buy and the jurisdiction you want to buy it in and get the appropriate advice, because there's always going to be somebody out there who doesn't understand the law and will pay more than they should for something that they just don't understand, and I would let them.
And I think one of the most difficult jobs for you also is that every single city has, every single jurisdiction has different rules and regulations. So it's not like somebody who is in, let's say in San Jose, know the rules in San Francisco. So you really have to find that attorney who specializes in that area.
Yeah. Oh, that definitely helps. And sometimes these things go to litigation as well. And if that's the situation, it of course helps to know someone that knows all the familiar faces in the local courthouse. So yeah, I would agree with that.
And when you mentioned something about like the cash for keys for the tenants to move out, and there is not something as simple as like, here go, let me just give you some money, you can move out now. You probably want to hire an attorney to draft something, so it might not come back and, I don't know, they might come back and sue you.
Yeah, and I think the theme here is, unfortunately, cities tend to infantilize tenants and think that they can't be responsible to make adult decisions on their own behalf. We had the first buyout ordinance in San Francisco. We got an amendment about a year and a half ago that my firm is in the process of suing the city over, which made it even more onerous. Basically, as soon as you start that negotiation, the tenant can't even enter a contract for 30 days. And then they get their 45 days after they enter it to change their mind for no reason. So these agreements have required language where if you do not have that language, it's voidable at the option of the tenant. It's a great idea to make sure that you have a qualified counsel disclosing the rights to the hear from that tenant again. Did I cut out? I'm sorry.
Yeah, you cut out for a few seconds. You're good.
Sorry about that. I was saying basically anytime you're aiming to enjoy the upside of vacancy decontrol with a voluntary agreement that where your tenant vacates, you want to make sure that you're never going to hear from them again in the form of, you didn't comply with the buyout agreement. By the way, I'm also suing you because of all the habitability issues. You want to make sure that these agreements are the full and final conclusion of that relationship.
Absolutely, because we do get those questions quite a bit. It's like, oh, can we just give them money? I'm like, no, you need to hire an attorney. Even I cannot do that for you. You have to have an attorney draft something to make sure that you're protected.
It's a good idea. Yeah. Well, I was going to say, even in the cities that don't have buyout ordinances, like I said, with the looming threat of a habitability lawsuit,
yeah,
it's always great to have it in writing and to get releases of claims for things that you might be worried about.
Yeah. And also, I'm curious about you as an attorney, seeing all these, obviously you have some of these you don't agree with, I mean, maybe you agree with. If you're going to craft something that is fair for everybody, the tenants, the landlords, then, and also can increase supply of the housing, how would you craft different proposal and regulations?
Oh, wow. How much time do we have? That might be a topic for episode 20.
Minutes,
back. Well, first of all, I'd have a seat at the table for the relevant constituents. we're very actively involved in legislation at the local level with the small property owners. This assumes that the city is going to enact a law that is not, for instance, preempted by Costa-Hawkins or preempted by the Ellis Act at the state level. It doesn't constitute a taking under the federal or California Constitution. We would like to assume that all of these things happen in the due course of enacting legislation through the formal process, and that is not always the case. There are lawsuits all the time. This is one of the things I mentioned earlier about changing the law as we work within it. So if I were going to guide a more holistic policy, I think I would have to start with listening to other constituents. And unfortunately, in San Francisco in particular, they ignore the small property owners. You were talking about the actual collectible rents over the last year or year over year. And unfortunately, at the state and the local level, government has treated property owners as a source of equity that can be released to solve the social problem of unemployment and inability of tenants to actually pay rent. So as an immediate issue, I'm not sure that was the worst thing. Stop non-payment of rent evictions in their tracks and let's figure something out, except they never figured the thing out. We have a rent relief fund based on federal appropriations for SB 91, that's the COVID Tenant Relief Act. And at least some landlords will be able to benefit from that and will be made partially whole from this fund for non-payment of rent, but it's not going to apply to everybody equally. It's focused primarily on the financial need of the tenant, not the financial need of the property owner. So overall, I would say a balanced approach to legislation would be better. I am also, I support the SFEMB movement. I think production of housing is important. I think some cities try a little too hard to focus on existing housing stock. We're considering the idea, I say we, Board of Supervisors, is considering a vacant residential unit tax in San Francisco because some property owners are just tired of it. They don't want to put their second home on the market. They'd rather use it for their kids when the kids are in town. Well, that's going to be punished in the form of a tax. Great, so supply would actually help this problem. Let's upzone, let's build more units. I think there's no one single solution, but I think the more groups you join forces with, the more voices you hear, the more constituencies you work with to understand their problems and their needs, you're going to come up with better outcomes overall.
Yeah. And also, obviously, San Francisco is also very known for their homeless issues. And they've been talking a lot about like rezoning some of the properties, could be especially hotels or motels, or even some people talk about offices, which I think it would be really hard to convert. I mean, do you have any thought about that?
I guess in simplest terms, my thoughts are homelessness in San Francisco is a very complicated problem. I want to believe if you have the means to help those who are suffering, you do it. And that's part of community, whether you're talking about your neighbors and homes nearby you or the unhoused. But it's a difficult problem. And I don't think it's fair that the burden should be borne entirely by one city, especially when Californians come from other cities or people come even from other states to benefit from San Francisco's great services for homeless people. You know, medical needs, sheltering, like you said, during the pandemic. We were using our hotels that couldn't be used for tourists. I think that was a great solution, but these need to be dynamic ones. They need to be multi-jurisdictional. I believe strongly in the connection of these groups. CalRA is a regional group that has a lot of local affiliate members. I think that's a great one to join. I was very excited to meet you and your group and see how we can just collaborate and share ideas going forward. These are complicated problems. They need everybody paying attention and trying to do something.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really love what you were saying. It's like multi-jurisdictional effort to fix this homelessness. Is not really just about San Francisco. It is truly everywhere. And it can't be like, okay, here you go, you take care of it, and then we're okay now. And I think it's also really difficult for residents. A lot of times residents say, I don't want them to be next door from me. So there are a lot of issues that need to be tackled. And yeah, I really hope that one day we can find a good solutions for the homelessness in San Francisco, because I just feel like San Francisco has suffered quite a bit during this pandemic, especially.
Yeah. But then back to your earlier point, you might not always see the change, but it's about the process and knowing that you're working toward it.
Yeah, exactly. And the offices, the inventory in the office space also actually the occupancy is still really low. And then obviously we've been talking about whether the companies are allowing their workers going back to work. And hopefully we are really working towards that so that people are going back to offices, maybe part-time. And I know, again, from my own experience, so many office lessees, they're looking for smaller spaces now because they said, oh, we don't know, we really don't need such a big footprint anymore. Oh, David has a question. Let me pull this over. What would be necessary to convince cities to subsidize builders to build for sale rather than build to lease? End result would be less to own condos due to possible lower HOA, help transition single family to condos easier by cost, especially in San Francisco, since most homes are attached anyways and lack of new non-radioactive lands. How would it be necessary to convince cities to subsidize builders? I think that is also another big question, is builders are picking and choosing cities to build based on the cost. Obviously, every single builder is looking for profit. So for cities, a lot of cities, they have these impact fee per unit, and it has really slowed down the building. I don't know if you have any thought about this as well.
Well, if the question is how to urge cities, I think vote for better representatives. But the mechanics of it, yeah, particularly in San Francisco, sometimes they don't even want the impact fees because impact fees go to a fund and things get built somewhere else. What they want is on-site affordable housing. If it's talking about development of condominiums, that would be in the form of below market rate units that are sold with price restrictions. They have to be occupied by the person who qualifies for them. They can't be rented out. If they're sold, they have to be sold through the program to another person who's qualified. I think those are all great solutions. I think the political problem with this is when you have a free-for-all with community groups that can ransom a project and they say, do this as 100% affordable housing or don't do it. Yeah. Well, you didn't get any housing because it won't pencil out. You make a great point. Developers have to look to where they can actually make the return on their investment. And if it can't be over here, it's going to be someone else's project or no project at all. So yeah, I think it all goes back to responsible government that's listening to all the different voices and thinking about not just the needs of the people and renters in particular who have already been there for a long time and have already benefited from things like rent control, but people who want to move in and want to become members of those communities and who also need a place to live.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I see that a lot of people absolutely love San Francisco, but at the same time, when it comes down to it, I do see some of our clients would say that I don't feel as safe anymore. So that's why we don't want to move there. And we might move out of San Francisco to live, or it's just, or the builders that we talk to, is just not, it doesn't make sense financially for us to build here because it has to be 100% affordable, or even I think 10%, 20% affordable housing. A lot of builders are expecting that, but at the same time, when it's 100%, that's when a lot of builders are really turning away and look for somewhere else to build. But in terms of build to rent or build to sell, I think right now build to lease is actually a really big thing out of state, especially because they have a lower land cost and a little bit easier to build. So it is pretty common and pretty profitable in other states, but probably not in San Francisco or in the Bay Area when land is so expensive.
Well, and of course, that's the thing, is that there's plenty of opportunities out of state for turnkey property ownership. You buy here because of scarcity, and scarcity drives up the cost.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. And how, Dominic asks, how are you looking at new people entering into the area with current San Francisco natives? Do they seem hostile or not as welcoming? I see this constantly, and I'm wondering how you're dealing with this in San Francisco.
That is, so I'm just going to answer that from the perspective of a personal anecdote, which is, like I said, I'm a tenant. I've been here 12 years. I'm 40 now. So I've spent more of my life outside of the city than in it. This is my home. I feel like a San Franciscan, but I'm sure there are plenty of people who would say otherwise. And that's sad. I think it becomes sometimes a conflict between the incumbents, the natives, versus those who would like to be part of the community. It's an economic question. It's about who gets the prize of being able to get affordable housing. And if some person owns has more means than they can afford this house or this apartment, and someone who has fewer means might get displaced. But this is happening all the time, all over the place. Story I heard yesterday, I think it was on NPR's Marketplace, was about the distortive effects of people fleeing the Bay Area during the pandemic and going to Truckee and driving up the cost of housing in Truckee. And all, you know, it was a small community, everybody was tightly knit, and now they're looking for other opportunities because they're feeling displaced. So it's a problem all over California, in my opinion, and I don't do development or land use so much, so this is anecdotal, but it seems to be the consequence of a decades or generational long approach to creating boons for incumbents and not looking to the future to creating enough housing for the new people that want to join communities.
You know, what you were talking about, it is actually really true, because it's really not just San Francisco, it's anywhere when there are new people coming into another community. Texas, that's what they were always saying, like, California, stop coming over. You don't want to drive around with your California plate, because they seem to not very happy because you've been driving the prices up. But at the same time, you know, I think a home, for me, because like that question and the what you guys are saying about like having someone else new coming into an area, just I think about like how I personally came here from Asia. I was really looking for a home here in America, and for us, we feel like this is our home, and for other people, it is really important for other people to accept you and welcome you in, and we all together build a much better society and much better community. It is unfortunately, we always find ways to try to separate each other. We are the original community here, and you're the newcomers here. So I think we have to really work together, understanding that everyone is just trying to find a home and be in this community together. And David asked, what about converting more empty office buildings to residential to help provide more housing? I think this is a question about zoning, though. It's not that easy.
Oh yeah, I guess it's not that easy, but there is a lot of pressure for it. We had a project on Mid-Market in San Francisco that originally was office buildings. We had to deal with the fact that a lot of tenants were there were a lot of artists living in offices, and we ended up withdrawing it under the Ellis Act. And it might be the only example of a post-Ellis Act termination that got condo converted, because the city just consolidated everybody to certain levels of the building and made it a residential condo. There's a big push for that in San Francisco in particular, but yeah, I think in cities where there is underused office area or office zoned neighborhoods that could also have residential, there's obviously ecological impacts of commuting. So if you can have everybody in a live-work community, from that perspective is better. But again, from my perspective, I think there's not a single approach. There are only holistic, multi-pronged approaches to solving this problem of scarcity.
Yeah, I think in the private sectors, a lot of people have really great ideas. Just like David, what you were saying, I think absolutely, you know, that will be great if we are able to convert some of these vacant office buildings. It's really hard to lease out nowadays, and then provide more housing. That seems to be such a common sense approach. Why not? You know, why shouldn't we repurpose these properties? But at the same time, that's why we also need help from the government to allow these rezoning so that this can happen, and then also the cost to convert these, because you're talking about now adding kitchen, adding, you know, more of the bathrooms into these buildings, and it's going to cost quite a bit to convert. But yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with you. If we can repurpose some of these buildings, that would definitely help with more housing, and hopefully then make housing more affordable in California and the Bay Area.
Yeah.
Great. Well, it's 5:15, perfect timing. Thank you so much, Justin. It's been such an honor to have you here talking to us about all these different regulations. If there's one thing that you would like our audience to know how we can help with these regulations, what should we do?
Engagement. I think your group is great, and it hits on a lot of the points we talked about today, which is how do you synthesize a community that has natives and transplants? You do it through engagement. You form groups like your town hall. Obviously, it's focused on an industry group, but that's a great example of it. As small property owners, for me, it's my way to join the community and work from sort of an advocacy and educational outreach perspective instead of just representing client at a time on their particular legal issues. I have a friend. Can I make a plug?
Absolutely,
for a second?
of course.
I have a friend from college who also lives in San Francisco on the Avenues, and he's also been frustrated with something you brought up, which is how do you feel safe when you see all of this stuff going on around you? So originally he got his daughters, he bribed or paid them in candy, depending on your perspective, gave them little grabbers, and they went around the neighborhood picking up trash. And that was just a little family project they did. And then he asked me, I see you getting involved. I would love to get involved too. What can I do? I connected him with some other like-minded people, and he started a group. I'm going to put it in the chat, called Refuse Refuse. It reads like refuse refuse or refuse refuse, but refuserefuse.org. And now he's organizing people in different communities to have an event, plan something, get something on the calendar, and go around and pick up trash. As soon as you start doing that, the neighborhood looks cleaner. People are less likely to throw away litter. I mean, what a better way to start with some small project and find a way to build communities out of it.
Yeah.
So that's my perspective. Find ways to get involved, join groups. If political engagement is your thing, again, calra.org is a great opportunity for that, and just keep getting involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really appreciate it. And this is one of the reasons why I started doing these webinars, is that so we can all, have the same passion about these topics and how do we make more affordable housing. And also, this is not just for real estate agents. I see a lot of webinars for real estate agents, but here we have like real estate investors, consumers from all different industries. So really appreciate everybody joining us today. And thank you again, Justin, for being here, talking to us. And I hope you guys will come back next month. I already have an idea what topic I want to talk about. I wonder if you guys want to put it in the chat. I was thinking about these appraisal issues these days, that so many people cannot get appraisal, that the appraisal value up to their purchase price. But at the same time, if you get 3 different appraisal, you can get 3 very, very, very different numbers, amazingly different numbers. If you guys are interested in this topic, let me know. I would love to, find a topic that interests most of you guys. So next time we can talk about that as well. All right.
And sorry, so my friend doesn't kill me. It's actually refuserefusesf.org. I just updated it in the chat.
Perfect. Yes, that's correct. That is the correct address. Thank you so much. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's segment. So please don't forget to join us next month. And if you want to have a live discussion with our speakers, be sure to register on www.haylengroup.com/townhall, or simply subscribe here. So then every month when we have our new video out, you will be notified. Thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing you again. Bye.